and where power felt as unstable as a cart on a broken road. Most people wouldn't last a week in this palace of shifting alliances and sudden danger. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, feel free to share your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Julius Caesar's life began not in triumph but in vulnerability. His relatives held on to stories of distant ancestors who claimed descent from the goddess Venus, but the reality around young Caesar was far less divine, a Rome full of debt, corruption, and loud arguments that spilled from the Senate into the streets. One well-known fact about his youth is that he grew up during the rule of the dictator Sulla, a man whose anger could reshape fates overnight. Caesar's uncle by marriage was Marius Sulla's bitter enemy, which put the boy in a dangerous position. She had a sharp mind and a calm presence, and many historians believe she shaped more of Caesar's early character than anyone else. Wealthy families sent their sons to learn philosophy and rhetoric, but Caesar seemed more fascinated by the human side of power rather than its academic theories. He watched senators argue in public, watched soldiers return from foreign wars wearing worn-out sandals, watched slaves carry the burdens of daily life while pretending not to exist. These observations gave him a sense of how fragile the Republic really was. Historians still argue whether Caesar's early ambition formed naturally or whether it was shaped almost entirely by the pressures around him. Some say he was destined for greatness. Others think he simply adapted faster than most. What's clear is that by his late teens, he had already made choices that hinted at his future. One of those choices was marrying Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, another enemy of Sulla. It was a bold move for someone who knew full well how dangerous political connections could be. Sulla didn't appreciate this defiance. He demanded that Caesar divorce Cornelia, perhaps expecting the young man to cave under pressure, but Caesar refused. It was the first major test of his courage, and it almost cost him his life. Sulla confiscated his property, stripped him of his titles, and forced him into hiding. Caesar moved from house to house, often relying on friends who risked their own safety just by letting him sleep under their roofs. At one point, he slipped out of the city entirely, traveling quietly along rural paths and avoiding places where Sulla's soldiers might be stationed. During this exile, he caught a fever that nearly killed him. There are accounts describing him lying in a small village house, sweating through the nights, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of smoke from the kitchen fire. A doctor, almost by chance, treated him without knowing he was saving the future ruler of Rome. This period taught Caesar something essential. Loyalty mattered, but survival required flexibility. As mentioned earlier in the outline of his life, no moment defines him alone, but these early brushes with danger shaped the calm confidence he would later show on battlefields and in Senate halls. When Sulla finally relented thanks to intercessions by influential friends, Caesar returned to Rome, but he didn't return the same. He had seen how quickly power could turn to dust. It is said that Sulla, after agreeing to spare him, murmured that there were many Mariuses in Caesar. The lessons were strict, filled with exercises that forced him to control tone, expression, and pacing. Caesar wasn't just learning to speak, he was learning to persuade. This training would become one of his sharpest tools. One story claims that he once skipped a political lecture to go watch acrobats in the marketplace, eating honeyed pastries while the performers balanced on ropes above the crowd. These small glimpses remind us that Julius Caesar wasn't born a marble statue. He was a living, curious young man growing up in a chaotic city. As Section 1 draws to its close, Caesar stands at the threshold of adulthood, shaped by danger, guided by a determined mother, and strengthened by the knowledge that Rome was both his birthplace and his greatest challenge. The shadows of ambition were already visible, even if the world around him didn't quite recognize what was coming. Crossing into danger became almost a rhythm in Caesar's early adulthood, a quiet expectation he carried with him as naturally as a soldier carries his shield. After the turmoil with Sulla calmed and the city regained a fragile sense of order, Caesar turned toward military service, partly out of obligation, partly out of a desire to rebuild what he had lost, and partly because he knew that understanding warfare was essential for anyone hoping to shape Rome's future. It wasn't heroism that pushed him forward at this stage. It was a practical instinct, sharpened by years spent watching powerful men rise and fall like waves in a storm. He joined the army in Asia, far from the familiar streets of Rome. There the air smelled of cedar wood and sea salt, and the mornings often began with the distant echo of hammers repairing ships. The Roman camps were busy, full of soldiers checking gear, polishing armor that wasn't nearly as shiny as paintings often suggest. Caesar was still young, not yet the commanding figure history would remember, but even then he showed an unusual blend of humility and ambition. He observed his superiors closely, learning not just strategy but the subtle art of earning loyalty through fairness. He saved the life of a fellow soldier, earning a civic crown of oak leaves, a rare honor, awarded only to those who preserved the life of a Roman citizen in battle. That simple wreath, light enough to rest on the head without weight, became a symbolic first step toward the future legends attached to his name. A charming detail from these years reveals a softer side of him. While stationed abroad, he developed a habit of keeping small travel journals. Instead, he recorded things like the taste of local fruit, the way foreign markets arranged their goods, even the songs he heard fishermen sing along the coast. He learned bits of local languages, watched how foreign chieftains settled disputes, and grew increasingly aware of how much Rome depended on regions it often treated with indifference. He wasn't yet trying to reshape the world, he was simply absorbing it, piece by piece. Historians still argue whether Caesar's courage in these early years came from natural boldness or from a desire to escape the political dangers that waited back home. Some scholars believe he used military service as a form of refuge from Sulla's remaining supporters, who weren't quick to forget old alliances. His time abroad came to a sudden halt when news broke that Sulla had died. The old dictator's passing shifted Rome's political landscape once again, opening doors that had been sealed shut for years. With cautious hope, Caesar returned to the capital. The Rome he found was familiar yet changed. The streets were the same, the public baths still steamed in the evenings, and the forum still buzzed with debate, but the fear that had lingered under Sulla's rule had softened. Caesar began taking small roles in public life. He prosecuted corrupt governors, delivering speeches that balanced sharp criticism with steady confidence. His training under Apollonius Molon showed in every gesture and pause. People began to notice the young man with a clear voice and determined posture. He wasn't yet a major political player, but he had a way of making even small trials feel important, as if they were previews of something larger. Around this time, something happened that pulled him back into danger yet again. While traveling across the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates. It sounds almost like the start of an adventure story, but the situation was deadly serious. The pirates demanded a ransom, expecting Caesar to tremble or beg. Instead, he scolded them for asking too little, insisting they raise the amount to reflect his true worth. This wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. By convincing them he was valuable, he increased his chances of survival. During his captivity, he treated the pirates not with fear but with a strange sense of superiority. He joined in their games, made jokes at their expense, and told them repeatedly that once he was free, he would return to punish them. The pirates laughed, assuming it was all part of his charm. They didn't know Caesar very well, Once the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar immediately raised a small fleet, hunted down the same pirates, captured them, and carried out the punishment he had promised. This act wasn't just revenge. It was a message to the world that Julius Caesar did not forget, did not exaggerate, and did not allow others to define his fate. It also showed the sharp evolution of the young man who had once hidden from Sulla's forces. Now, he was the one commanding action. When he returned to Rome after this ordeal, the city felt smaller in some ways. He had crossed real danger, stared uncertainty in the face, and emerged with a clearer understanding of his own resolve. Even the Senate, which often treated young politicians with indifference, began to pay closer attention to him. As the section closes, Caesar stands on a rising slope of his life shaped by battlefields, sharpened by captivity, and strengthened by bold decisions. The power of loyalty, and the dangers that tested it, had already begun to carve his path forward. And although he didn't win every case, he gained something even more valuable: attention. A small, quirky detail from this time shows his skill at performance. Caesar refused to project his voice in the rough, shouting style many orators used. Instead, he spoke clearly and steadily, forcing the crowd to quiet down so they could hear him. It worked. People leaned in rather than pulling away. To strengthen his position further, Caesar married Pompey, a move that connected him to the influential Pompeian family. The marriage itself, however, didn't last long. A scandal arose during the festival of the Bonadi, where a disguised man attempted to sneak into the women-only ceremony held in Caesar's home. No one could prove Pompey was involved, but Caesar divorced her anyway, famously stating that the wife of Caesar must be above suspicion. It wasn't anger, it was political protection. Small moments like this reveal how deeply he understood Rome's expectations and how quickly rumors could spread. As he continued to rise, Caesar held the office of quaestor, which allowed him to serve in Hispania. The journey there was long, passing through rugged landscapes where the wind carried dust across winding mountain paths. In Hispania, he managed finances, resolved legal disputes, and gained valuable administrative experience. It was during this time that he reportedly cried after seeing a statue of Alexander the Great. It might seem trivial, but it reflects the same careful attention he later applied to military strategy. Caesar's ability to connect with people, whether soldiers, common citizens, or influential allies, made him a rising star. He is a contender where, strategic and climbing steadily toward a destiny the Republic is not yet ready to face. Gaul reshapes a man in ways no Senate debate or courtroom speech ever could. For Julius Caesar, the wide northern lands full of forests that whispered with cold winds, rivers that carved through wild terrain, and tribes whose loyalties shifted like the seasons became the place where he transformed from a skilled politician into a figure whose name carried the weight of legend. When he secured the consulship in Rome, he had already succeeded in politics more than most men dreamed, but Gaul was where the world began to recognize his unmistakable command. After his term as consul ended, Caesar struck an agreement that formed the first triumvirate, a political alliance with Pompey and Crassus. Each man brought something vital. Pompey had military prestige, Crassus had immense wealth, and Caesar contributed public popularity and sharp strategy. This coalition allowed Caesar to secure the governorship of not one province, but several across the northern frontier. It was a bold step, one that surprised even some of his closest allies. As mentioned earlier in his climb, Caesar understood the power of alliances, but Gaul would test and reshape all of them. The moment he arrived, he realized the scale of the task before him. The region was enormous, filled with tribes that traded, fought, merged, and divided with little warning. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and nights often carried the howls of distant animals across open plains. Gaul wasn't just a borderland, it was a mosaic of cultures, histories, and rivalries, each one presenting new challenges. One well-known fact from this period is that he wrote detailed commentaries on the Gallic Wars, describing events with a calm, measured tone that made even fierce battles sound controlled. These writings weren't just military reports, they were political tools, shaping public opinion in Rome and reminding citizens of the constant victories under his command. They weren't filled with emotional language. Instead, they delivered facts with a clarity that made his success feel inevitable. But behind those crisp descriptions lay a reality far more complex. He faced enormous armies, harsh weather, and shifting alliances. The men adored this. They felt seen not as numbers in a legion but as individuals. Caesar, who had once supervised seating arrangements for Roman festivals, now used that same attention to detail to build an army whose loyalty bordered on fierce devotion. The campaigns were long and exhausting. His forces crossed rivers on makeshift bridges that creaked under the weight of entire legions. They built fortifications in storms. Their armor soaked and cold, they marched through dense forests where the sunlight barely reached the ground. And yet, they followed him, trusting his calm presence even in impossible situations. One of his most famous achievements was the rapid construction of a massive bridge over the Rhine, built in just 10 days. The engineering feat stunned both Romans and the tribes watching from across the water. Caesar's intention wasn't to conquer new lands, it was to demonstrate Roman capability and his own strategic imagination. The message was clear: no barrier, natural or political, would stop him. Historians still argue whether his motivation in Gaul was rooted in genuine Roman security concerns or whether he sought glory to strengthen his political future. Some believe he viewed Gaul as a necessary shield for Rome. Others argue he saw it as a stage on which he could build a legacy powerful enough to overshadow every rival. Whatever the truth, his actions there reshaped him into a commander whose confidence radiated through every decision. Yet Gaul wasn't only a place of victories. Caesar faced setbacks to ambushes, harsh winters, and moments when supplies ran dangerously low. During one brutal season, his troops were forced to dig deep storage pits for grain and ration every meal. The chilling winds blew so hard that campfires sputtered. There is a story that Caesar once shared his own makeshift cloak with a shivering soldier during a night watch, insisting they stand together against the cold. True or not, such stories traveled quickly through the ranks. binding his men to him even more tightly. The most intense challenge came from Vercingetorix, the young Arvernian leader who united many Gallic tribes in a massive resistance. He was intelligent, charismatic, and determined, almost a mirror of Caesar, but standing on the opposite side of the battlefield. Their struggle became one of the defining arcs of Caesar's career. Battles raged through valleys and atop fortified hills, with both sides adapting and counter-adapting. The siege of Alesia marked a turning point. Caesar's legions built not one but two defensive walls, one facing inward, toward the besieged city, and another facing outward to guard against reinforcements. It was a masterpiece of engineering and strategy. The clash that followed was fierce, filled with shouts, dust, and the pounding of shields. Yet amid the chaos, Caesar demonstrated remarkable calm. He rode along the lines, offering brief instructions, checking formations, and reminding his troops of the plan they had practiced. When Vercingetorix eventually surrendered, he did so with dignity, laying his weapons at Caesar's feet. The image became symbolic, echoed through centuries of For Caesar, it wasn't triumph alone, it was confirmation that Gaul had reshaped him into something larger than any political office could define. Victory in Gaul made him one of the wealthiest and most celebrated men in Rome. The spoils of war helped pay off his enormous debts, and his soldiers loyal to him above all returned with stories of his bravery and brilliance. These stories stirred both admiration and worry. Some senators feared he had grown too powerful, too beloved, too independent. The alliance of the triumvirate began to strain under the pressure of these shifting dynamics. But before Caesar could face Rome again, he stood in Gaul one last time, looking across the lands that had changed him. The forests, the rivers, the fields dotted with Roman camps, they had witnessed his evolution. As mentioned earlier, political ambition had driven him toward opportunity, but Gaul had taken that ambition and forged it into certainty. When he finally turned his gaze back toward Rome, he carried with him the weight of conquest, the loyalty of legions, and the quiet realization that the Republic would never greet him as the same man who had once left its gates. After years in Gaul, with victories that echoed through the Republic, Caesar prepared to return home, expecting honor, celebration, perhaps even a triumphant parade. The old friendship that once held them together began to fray after years of distance, councils of suspicion, and shifting loyalties. Pompey, now stationed in Rome, slowly drifted toward the senatorial elite, who eagerly encouraged him to see Caesar as a rival rather than a partner. As mentioned earlier, Caesar had always understood the fragile nature of political alliances, but this was different. It wasn't about temporary jealousy or normal competition. It was about survival. His enemies insisted that once he stepped inside Rome without relinquishing command of his army, he would be prosecuted. They wanted him disarmed, alone, and vulnerable. To them, a powerful general outside Rome was dangerous. A powerful general entering Rome was unthinkable. One well-known fact is that Caesar's legal situation became the spark that ignited everything. By law, he had to give up his command before entering the city, but giving it up would leave him exposed to charges designed not to serve justice, but to eliminate him. He requested to run for consul, and absentia privilege some had been granted in the past, but the Senate blocked him. Each refusal pushed him closer to a point where compromise no longer felt possible. A small, quirky detail from this tense period reveals how Caesar coped with the pressure. He developed a habit of pacing his tent late at night, tracing slow steps back and forth across the wooden floorboards. His officers often pretended not to notice, but they heard him stop from time to time as if frozen by a new realization or a sudden thought. Historians still argue whether Pompey truly believed Caesar intended to conquer the city, or whether he allowed himself to be persuaded by senators who feared their own loss of influence. Some scholars suggest Pompey felt cornered by obligation. Others believe he genuinely misjudged Caesar's intentions. They had marched with him through rivers and forests, starved beside him in harsh winters, and watched him stand calm in the chaos of battle. He didn't command loyalty, he earned it. When he presented Rome's ultimatum, the legions didn't hesitate. They would stay at his side. Still, Caesar hesitated. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on him. The moment arrived on a cold January night. The Rubicon itself was not a grand river. It wasn't wide or dramatic. It slipped quietly through the landscape, its waters shallow and dark, reflecting faint starlight. He whispered a brief phrase, often retold as meaning the die is cast, though scholars still debate whether he actually said it or whether the line was added later for dramatic effect. The sound of hooves splashing into the river marked the beginning of a path that would shake Rome to its foundations. His soldiers followed, their steps steady, their expressions firm. Some later remarked that the night smelled of damp earth and cold air, and that the silence felt deeper than usual, as if the world itself were holding its breath. When they reached the opposite bank, Caesar didn't raise his voice or deliver a triumphant speech. He simply looked toward the road leading south, the road back to the city that had shaped him, praised him, challenged him, and feared him. Behind him, his men adjusted their packs and shields, preparing for whatever the coming days would bring. The march toward Rome began at a careful, steady pace. City after city opened its gates to him, not out of fear, but out of long-standing trust built during the years when he had defended Rome's interests far from its walls. Each welcome stirred deeper alarm in the Senate. Pompey withdrew from the capital, believing a temporary retreat would preserve his forces. The Senate followed in haste, carrying their documents, treasures, and hopes of regrouping. As the section closes, Caesar walks a path he never sought lightly, carrying the weight of a choice that would forever redefine Rome. The Rubicon, small and unassuming, now lived in his memory as the quiet river that stood between the world he knew and the world he had just stepped into. The long years of conquest settled into a quieter rhythm once. Caesar took control of Rome, and the city itself began reshaping around his presence as though the marble, the streets, and even the murmuring crowds understood that a new era had arrived. The story carried forward from those tense days after the Rubicon, moving from urgency into a steady expansion of authority. Rome, still shaken by civil war, felt like a place both exhausted and expectant. And Caesar, stepping deeper into its political heart, began to rebuild the world he believed should exist. He moved carefully at first, aware that the Senate watched every choice he made. Yet he also acted with the calm confidence of someone who felt guided by momentum. One of the major facts well known from this time is his sweeping calendar reform. The old Roman calendar had drifted so far out of alignment with the seasons that festivals no longer matched their intended times of year. Caesar, with help from learned astronomers, introduced the Julian calendar, the basic structure still used in much of the world today. It was a practical adjustment, but it also symbolized a kind of fresh start, the reorganizing of time itself. Despite his new authority, he tried to present himself as a restorer, not a destroyer. He pardoned former enemies, invited exiles home, and attempted to steady the economic chaos left behind by years of conflict. Some people saw these actions as signs of mercy. Others whispered that such forgiveness was simply a strategy to win loyalty. And as mentioned earlier in old stories told by Roman writers, public perception mattered almost as much as deeds. In quieter moments, Caesar focused on rebuilding civic structures. Roads were repaired, debts were restructured, and new colonies were founded across distant lands to settle unemployed citizens. A lesser-known detail from this period tells how he once inspected a construction project himself, stepping down into dusty, unfinished foundations to speak with workers. The story may be exaggerated, but it reflects the image many Romans held of him, a leader who didn't mind blending the practical with the grand. Still, power gathers weight quickly, and Caesar felt that weight pressing onto every decision. His position as dictator for 10 years, later extended to a lifetime appointment, created unease even among those who supported him. Historians still argue whether Caesar genuinely intended to become a monarch, or whether the circumstances simply pushed him toward that image. Romans, shaped by centuries of hatred for kings, felt a natural tension rise whenever anyone seemed to hold too much power. Yet, for the ordinary people of Rome, daily life often drifted towards small comforts. Markets reopened, grain shipments stabilized, and festivals regained their familiar rhythm under the new calendar. When Caesar appeared in public games or processions, crowds greeted him with cheers that echoed between the stone walls. He moved through those scenes with the calm expression of someone who understood the stage he walked on. The Senate, however, remained complicated terrain. Caesar expanded its membership, adding new men from across Italy and the provinces, hoping to modernize and diversify it. But the traditional elite saw this as an erosion of their influence. Gentle tension thickened around him, not loud enough to disrupt the peace, but real enough to sharpen every glance in the curia. Even in moments of celebration, there were reminders of growing distance. One vivid account describes how a golden throne was placed for Caesar during public events, a gesture meant to honor him. Some people saw this as harmless pageantry, while others murmured uneasily at the symbolism. The boundary between honor and monarchy was thin in Rome. Through all this, Caesar continued to draft laws at a remarkable pace. He reorganized courts, restructured provincial governance, and worked to reduce corruption. His days often stretched long into the evening, and he sometimes invited scholars, writers, and even comedians to dine with him, mixing political debates with softer conversations. He enjoyed stories, especially ones that revealed sharp wit. Quiet humor found its way into his routine, small moments that lightened the heavy work of ruling. But even in this period of rebuilding, Caesar kept one eye turned outward. He planned new campaigns, particularly in the east, imagining vast expansions of Roman influence. Maps were spread across tables, routes discussed, supplies calculated. He seemed restless, even with all he had already achieved. Rome, meanwhile, adjusted to the new normal, a city balancing admiration and anxiety, progress and suspicion. Caesar walked through it with steady purpose, unaware of how tightly the threads of his fate were already weaving themselves. And as the city's breath eased into a slower, more hopeful rhythm, he continued onward, carrying the story toward the moment when celebration, fear, loyalty, and resentment would all meet in the same room. The final weeks of Caesar's life unfolded with a strange mixture of promise and unease. As though Rome itself sensed a turning point approaching, even if no one could describe it clearly, his preparations for the Great Eastern Campaign dominated his schedule. He spent long stretches reviewing troop lists, supply routes, diplomatic reports, and notes from scouts who had traveled ahead. The scale of the expedition was immense, a project meant to outshine even his conquest of Gaul, and yet, beneath all this grand planning, the air in Rome carried a quiet tension that seemed to follow him. He moved through the city with the confidence he had earned through decades of victory, but there were moments when he paused, sensing something unsettled in the people around him. The Senate continued honoring him with titles, statues, and ceremonial privileges. One well-known fact from this final stage is that they decreed his image should be placed among the gods. Some saw this as a symbolic compliment. Others felt it crossed a line the Republic was never meant to cross. The unease did not reveal itself openly, but it lived in lowered voices, tense glances, and the careful way senators arranged their expressions in his presence. Yet Caesar himself remained focused. He streamlined grain distribution, worked to stabilize provincial administration, and tried to finalize reforms that would run smoothly in his absence during the coming expedition. He spoke often of the future of land still unexplored, of the knowledge Rome might gain, of the prosperity he believed lay ahead. He imagined a stronger, wider republic, not a weaker one, a quieter. Lesser-known detail from this period tells of a moment when Caesar invited a small group of engineers to his home late at night. He stayed up with them discussing new bridge designs, curious about how they might cross certain eastern rivers more efficiently. Servants noted that he listened more than he spoke, occasionally testing the models with his fingers, almost like a child exploring a puzzle. Whether the story happened exactly that way or grew in retelling, it reflects how deeply he immersed himself in practical problems. Still, the atmosphere around him changed. As mentioned earlier in scattered accounts, some senators believed he took criticism too lightly. Others thought he brushed aside their concerns with too much humor, and some, those who considered themselves guardians of the Republic, convinced themselves that drastic action was the only answer. Historians still argue whether Caesar underestimated the danger or simply refused to believe the Senate would turn against him. Some think he trusted too easily in his policy of clemency. Others believe he sensed the threat but felt protected by his popularity. What remains clear is that he moved through these final days without altering his habits. He continued attending meetings, reviewing documents, dining with friends, and walking in public as though life was steady and predictable. On the morning of the Senate session he was meant to attend, various omens and warnings brushed against the edges of his routine. His wife Calpurnia reportedly dreamed of danger and begged him to stay home. A servant found a sacrificed animal with strange markings. A philosopher attempted to hand Caesar a letter containing a warning. These stories blend fact and legend, but they show how later generations imagined the atmosphere around him, a swirl of hints that something irreversible was approaching. Yet Caesar prepared to go to the Curia of Pompey. He believed the session would be brief. He expected to finalize certain administrative matters before returning to his campaign preparations. The streets were calmer that morning, quieter than usual, as though the city held its breath. Inside the Senate, senators gathered with stiff expressions, exchanging shallow greetings. The conspirators hid their anxiety beneath layers of rehearsed calm. People later described the atmosphere as uncomfortably warm, the air heavy. The space too enclosed details that might have grown with the retelling, but they captured the mood that surrounded this pivotal day. As Caesar approached the building, he carried himself with the same steady stride he had used for years. He greeted a few people, accepted a document without reading it, and stepped inside unaware of how the meeting would unfold. The conspirators closed around him gradually, forming a circle disguised as casual conversation. The momentum of decades of battles, reforms, victories, rivalries, and relentless ambition converged in that room. Rome, outside, continued its morning activities. Merchants opened stalls. Children played near fountains. Workers lifted stones for new constructions he had ordered. Life went on, unaware that history was about to pivot in a blink. And inside, the moment arrived. The events that followed inside the Curia of Pompey came together with a speed that left almost no space for understanding. As though time itself narrowed into a single, irreversible moment. Caesar stepped into the Senate expecting discussion, perhaps mild resistance from certain senators, but certainly nothing beyond the usual friction of politics. The conspirators, however, had rehearsed every motion, every position, every signal. They had convinced themselves they were protecting the Republic, even though the path they chose would plunge Rome into deeper uncertainty. He took his seat, and at first the room seemed calm. A few senators approached him under the pretext of presenting petitions. The circle around him tightened almost imperceptibly. Caesar, distracted by the documents in front of him, didn't notice the glances shared between the conspirators. He didn't see their tense postures or the way their hands hovered in unnatural stiffness. One of the well-known historical facts of this moment is that the first strike came suddenly, delivered by a man Caesar once spared. It landed awkwardly, not fatal, more a jolt of shock than injury. Caesar reacted instinctively, rising to defend himself. But the room erupted as the conspirators surged forward. He tried to fend them off, calling out, not in fear but in bewildered protest, stunned that the men he had forgiven and elevated would turn on him. Yet even as chaos filled the chamber, one quieter detail appears in some ancient accounts. A small statue of Pompey stood nearby, and Caesar, stumbling to find balance, collapsed at its base. The symbolism, whether exaggerated or not, became part of the legend, as though fate had woven irony into the scene with careful intention. The senators who were not involved froze in place. They watched with horror as the blows continued, too numerous to count, delivered by men who believed this moment would save the Republic. Historians still argue whether the conspirators truly understood the consequences of what they were doing. Some say they were idealists blinded by nostalgia for a republic that had already changed beyond recognition. Others believe jealousy and fear of losing influence fueled them more than noble principle. When it was over, the conspirators stepped back, breathing heavily, their tunics stained, their expressions uncertain. Caesar lay still, his body marked by countless wounds. The room, moments earlier humming with tension, fell into a heavy, disbelieving silence. Outside the Curia, the city carried on, unaware of how dramatically its course had just shifted. Then came panic. When news reached the public, confusion rippled through Rome. Some people fled their homes, others rushed toward the Forum, desperate for information. Many cried openly in the streets, grieving the man who had brought them stability after years of civil war. Markets closed early. Doors were bolted. Rumors spread at a frantic pace, some accurate, others wild exaggerations. The conspirators expected to be hailed as liberators, but instead they walked into a storm they had not prepared for. Their speeches about restoring freedom fell flat. The crowd's reaction was far from grateful. Instead, fear deepened, uncertainty took hold, and familiar patterns of instability returned with startling speed. Mark Antony, who had avoided the attack by being delayed or distracted, accounts vary, stepped forward to steady the city. He secured Caesar's papers and household, understanding how volatile the situation was. He moved cautiously, balancing the demands of the Senate with the expectations of the people. As the shock settled, Caesar's body was prepared for a public funeral. This moment, described by many ancient writers, became one of the most emotional gatherings in Roman history. Antony's speech stirred the crowd so deeply that grief turned into anger. People seized furniture and wooden structures, creating an impromptu pyre in the Forum. Flames rose high, the heat pushing onlookers back, sparks drifting like fireflies into the early evening sky. A lesser-known anecdote says that someone in the crowd placed a small wreath of spring flowers beside the flames, perhaps a child, perhaps an old woman, and it became a symbol of the quiet love many felt for Caesar, far removed from politics and power. As the fire burned, Rome felt unmoored once again. The conspirators fled or hid. The city trembled on the edge of future conflicts. The republic they hoped to restore did not reappear. Instead, Caesar's death created a vacuum that would pull Rome into new wars, new leaders, and eventually a new system altogether. But the story of his life didn't end in the chaos of the Forum. It stretched onward, shaping the world through the people who followed him, the ideas he left behind, and the legacy that continued growing even as the smoke faded from the sky. The aftermath of Caesar's death swept over Rome like a sudden storm, leaving every street, forum, and household steeped in uncertainty. Citizens who had once cheered now moved with caution, glancing over shoulders, wary of rumors. The carefully constructed order that Caesar had built over decades of campaigning, governing, and reform had vanished in an instant, leaving the Republic to stumble under the weight of its own contradictions. Mark Antony emerged as a central figure, navigating both grief and strategy. He delivered public speeches, secured Caesar's property, and reminded the people of the man they had loved, not merely the politician they had feared. Antony's ability to channel public emotion was remarkable. One well-known fact is that he staged a funeral so moving that it incited riots and drove the conspirators from the city. Servants whispered about the quiet moments when Antony and others moved through Caesar's house, seeing signs of his daily routines: a still-written ledger, a half-finished letter, personal scrolls, and the faint scent of oil from late-night writing sessions. These small remnants suggested a life lived not only in public triumphs, but in intimate attention to detail, a life of careful planning and reflective thought. Historians still argue whether the conspirators anticipated the depth of public backlash or whether they simply misjudged the loyalty Caesar inspired. Some scholars believe their intentions were rooted in principle, a desperate attempt to preserve a fading republic. Others argue that envy and personal ambition played larger roles than admitted, and that the act, however justified in their minds, hastened Rome's transformation into an empire rather than saving it. The power vacuum sparked conflicts that would consume the republic for years. His campaigns, political reforms, personal anecdotes, and ultimate demise became the foundation of a story that generations would revisit. Even minor details, his careful letters, his walks among soldiers, his attention to festivals and infrastructure were preserved, celebrated, and debated. They contributed to the portrait of a man who had lived with restless purpose, balancing ambition, intellect, and public service. Rome, however, never returned fully to the city Caesar had known. The Republic's institutions, fragile before, began to change irrevocably. Caesar's memory lingered not as a shadow over a fallen leader but as a template for what could be achieved when skill, vision, and audacity converged. In every triumph, every reform, and every challenge, echoes of his life resonated. As Section 10 closes, one sees a man whose existence shaped more than his own era, whose decisions and vision pushed boundaries, inspired loyalty, and left lessons that would ripple across history. Caesar's life, full of daring, careful calculation, and restless energy, concluded in a single, fateful moment, yet continued to influence the path of Rome and the imagination of the world for centuries. The story of Julius Caesar drifts to a quieter pace now, as though the bustling streets of Rome have finally exhaled and the weight of centuries rests gently on the city. His life, full of movement, strategy, and ambition, leaves behind a stillness that is almost reflective, a moment to notice the little details that defined him: the careful letters he wrote by candlelight, the soldiers he greeted by name, the meticulous attention he paid to even the smallest of public works. In those small acts, one senses a man who moved through the world with purpose, yet never entirely lost sight of the human rhythms around him. Rome itself, after all the storms of conquest and civil war, continued. Markets reopened, children laughed in the streets, and the stone buildings glimmered in the shifting sunlight. Even amid political upheaval, life persisted, carrying forward lessons of leadership, loyalty, and the fragile balance between ambition and caution. Caesar's legacy settled into these spaces, as tangible in the streets as it was in the records left behind, a quiet echo in the daily lives of those who came after. It is easy to imagine him walking once more through the Forum, not as a general or dictator but as a man attentive to the pulse of the city he loved, aware that time moves quickly, that victories are fleeting, and that influence is measured not only in power but in memory. The rhythm of his life, its triumphs, missteps, and bold choices, remains a story of motion, of daring, and of the quiet moments that shaped a restless mind. The world moves on, but the echoes of his journey linger, soft and enduring, like the last whisper of a fading breeze.